I guess this is the end of the road in one of the weirdest comic book stories I've ever covered here on the channel. Diamond Comics filed for Chapter 11, went into bankruptcy, went into auction, tried to change the results of the auction, got it reversed back. Then that bidder actually just left. Who they wanted to win in the first place ends up winning the auction, and basically Diamond Comics Distributors has collapsed overnight. There will be apparently no Diamond Comics moving forward. It didn't make a whole lot of sense when you looked at it that Universal Distributors only wanted Alliance Gaming. And then Ad Populum, who wanted the Diamond Toys line, also acquired Diamond Comics Distributors. It didn't feel like Ad Populum would really want to be a comic book distributor, and it turns out they are not. There's been a ton of layoffs over the past 24 to 48 hours. There is going to be a third distributor, but it will have nothing to do with the infrastructure and what is left over from the ashes of Diamond Comics, the long-standing monopoly in comic book distribution, which ended a few years ago and could not survive the competition. Let's talk about all these details and where this leaves everybody. The fallout from the Diamond Comics acquisition by Ad Populum and Universal Distribution has officially hit catastrophic levels, with multiple reports describing this week's mass layoffs as a bloodbath. High-ranking figures across the company are gone, including Chris Powell, Diamond's Chief Sales and Service Officer, Stuart Carter, Sales Manager, Terry Hellman, Associate Director of Online Sales, Rich Johnson, Vice President of Sales and Business Development, and Steve Leaf, Assistant Manager. Most of the Diamond Book Distributors division has also been wiped out. Only 3 employees reportedly remain. It's also been confirmed that the entire point-of-sale tech support department has been eliminated. Early signs suggest this is just the beginning, with numerous non-disclosure agreements tied to layoffs indicating more upheaval may be coming. The rapid and sweeping nature of these terminations has left longtime employees and retailers stunned. So there you go, massive layoffs across the board as these parts of Diamond Comics Distributors are being incorporated and added to the companies that acquired them. Ad Populum is basically wiping out the comic book distribution arm of what they acquired, while Universal Distributors is taking the infrastructure of Alliance Gaming Distributors and adding it to their portfolio. And also they're going to be expanding it a little bit into comic book distribution. I personally feel bad for all these people, even if I think Diamond was not very well run. If I think Diamond made a lot of key catastrophic mistakes over the last several years that caused their own downfall. I don't want to see people be out of the job. I don't want to see people laid off. I did hope that perhaps Diamond Comics Distributors would be able to continue on in some form, but it appears that was not in the cards. Amid the chaos, there's growing speculation that Diamond Comics Distributors, as we've known it, is finished. Ad Populum, who officially acquired Diamond, reportedly has no interest in salvaging the core comic distribution business. There's been no official word on the fate of cornerstone programs like Previews Magazine or Free Comic Book Day, both flagship initiatives historically run by Diamond. Meanwhile, other key services like Comic Suite and Pullbox software have already been discontinued as of this week. What remains of Diamond's infrastructure appears to be getting gutted in real time, with no clear future outline for any of its long-standing retail support systems. So a lot of the things that comic book retailers use to order and know what was coming up from Diamond, all those software tools are basically not existent anymore. As I mentioned earlier, they laid off the entire tech support division for that, and that stuff is no longer operational. There are people out there saying, hey, if you do have Comic Suite or Pullbox, you need to be basically backing up all of your data because you're not going to have access to it for very much longer, even if you still do at this particular time. But basically, they've gutted it, they're getting rid of it, and it appears that Diamond Comics Distributors, which was acquired by Ad Populum, there is no plan to continue on with Diamond Comics Distributors. The infrastructure in place regarding warehouses, the offices that they had, the employees that they had, if they are valuable, they are being pulled into Ad Populum, probably to do other jobs, and everything else is basically going by the wayside. While this is not officially confirmed, with all the stuff that we've seen happening and all the things that are being talked about, Diamond Comics is no more, essentially as of this week. Now, there was another player in this besides Ad Populum, and this is where it gets really interesting. While Diamond collapses Universal Distribution, the company that also acquired Alliance Game Distributors has already positioned itself as the next big player in the U.S. direct market. They've reportedly lined up deals with major publishers and will operate using existing Alliance Games infrastructure, essentially stepping in as Diamond's successor. In addition, Diamond UK may soon be folded into Universal in a separate transaction, giving them international comic distribution reach. All signs point to Universal playing a major role in shaping the next era of comic book distribution, just not through the remnants of Diamond. Universal Distributors paid a lot more to acquire Alliance Game Distributors than Populum paid to acquire Diamond Comic Book Distributors, Diamond Book Distributors, as well as the Diamond Select toy line. Now, if they wanted to continue on and become a major player within the comic book distribution sphere, which everything points to, that is exactly what Universal Distribution is going to do, they easily could have folded in the Diamond Comic Distributor portion into their acquisition, but they apparently had no interest in doing business the way that Diamond was doing business when it came to comic book distribution. They didn't like their staff, they didn't like their infrastructure, they didn't like their reputation, they didn't like the brand. So they're going to restart as comic book distributors using the framework and infrastructure that comes along with Alliance Games Distributors and start basically from scratch, getting new contracts and all that kind of stuff, rather than going with what already existed that they could have acquired very, very easily with Diamond Comics Distributors. It appears they didn't even want the contracts that were in place that will likely all be null and void at this point for comic book distribution for a ton of small press publishers in North America. And that is a very damning statement on what people felt about the way Diamond Comic Distributors were run, their reputation within the industry, and essentially saying, we would rather start over with something that was never intended to be comic book distribution. We would rather start over with that than with what Diamond Comic Distributors have already had in place. Now, I imagine there will be some key personnel that are now gainfully unemployed because of all these layoffs that Universal Distributors will reach out to, bring into the fold, because they do have relationships, they do have knowledge about comic book distribution, but obviously they did not want to continue on with business as usual when it came to Diamond Comics Distributors. Now, where does this leave all of us? For retailers, the abrupt changes have been nothing short of disorienting. There's been little to no formal communication from the new owners about what comes next, and it now appears all business through Diamond Comics Distributors is effectively over. Small publishers, many of whom relied on Diamond for national reach, are scrambling for answers about the status of their existing distribution deals. If they haven't already been secured with alternate arrangements with Universal Distribution or another provider, their futures are up in the air. What's clear is that Universal has no intention of keeping the Diamond name, staff, or contracts alive. For decades, Diamond was the center of the direct market. As of now, it's a ghost, and the industry is scrambling to find out what comes next. And I imagine if you're a smaller American publisher out there and you hear the news that Universal's distribution is starting to take on comic book distribution and has already secured several agreements and contracts with comic publishers, and you weren't called, you're probably scrambling right now, wondering what your future is going to be. It appears Penguin Random House has no interest or want in regards to bringing in more small press into their comic book distribution. We're not really sure about Lunar, although there are a couple publishers that work with Lunar that you can still sub-distribute through. And obviously that'll all go out through Lunar. A lot of people are going to be turning to Universal Distributors and looking what's going on. This will probably be a win for Canadian comic book shops because that is a Canadian company. I imagine it's going to be a lot cheaper and more effective if you're a comic book shop in Canada to use Universal Distribution when it comes to comic book distribution. Obviously, this is not up and running, but this is all in the ground stages, early stages of development. Before all this happened, basically every major publisher had already abandoned Diamond Comics Distributors, and a lot of these smaller, more relevant publishers, including, I think, Titan, as of a couple of weeks ago, had also signed agreements with other comic book distribution. So as far as the major titles and the big titles going out there, Diamond will not be available, but you can still go through Lunar and Penguin Random House. But for a lot of these smaller publishers, it's going to be a lot more difficult, and we shall see what exactly Universal Distribution has in mind for how they're going to tackle the comic book distribution issue in North America. Very, very difficult times for small publishers and certainly retailers trying to figure out and gauge what is the new normal when it comes to comic book distribution now that the long-time monopoly in comic book distribution is no more. Essentially, as of this week, Diamond Comic Distributors are dead. And there's been massive layoffs, been described as a bloodbath. And there are going to be a lot of people out there looking for new employment, looking for new opportunities elsewhere. hopefully a lot of them find a nice, comfortable landing spot within the comic book industry. But I do imagine some of them are going to have to look elsewhere, as this is kind of the big fallout of Diamond's Chapter 11 bankruptcy following years and years of mismanagement, and really the direct fallout of Diamond Comics Distributors deciding to unilaterally shut down the entire comic book industry and expose themselves to all kinds of competition that essentially put them out of business within a few years. Very, very sad story. I hate to see anybody losing their job. But if you're terrible at what you do, and when I say that, I'm talking about Diamond Comics Distributors as a whole, and you can't evolve and you can't improve, you are eventually going to go out of business. And this was always the most likely result as soon as Lunar and other competition came on board within comic book distribution, because it was quite apparent after decades that Diamond Comics Distributors were never going to change. And if there is a better example of how poorly they were looked upon, Universal Distribution wants to do comic book distribution. They refused to acquire Diamond Comics Distribution, which would have come with the personnel, the infrastructure, the contracts to start doing all that essentially from day one. They said, no, we want no part of what Diamond is, was, or was supposed to be in the future. We're going to start our own game up as a third major distributor, reportedly in North America when it comes to comic books. If you appreciate this kind of comic book news coverage that you can only find right here on Think Critical YouTube, and you'd like to support the channel and the mission to keep highlighting and spotlighting comic books in the industry, there's one place to do that. It is Thinking Critical Patreon. There's a link in the video description. There's a button right here, and we do hope to see you very, very soon.